I'm Danny McCaslin. I'm a systems administrator with Frederick Water. We are a public utility located in Frederick County, Virginia, which is northwestern Virginia, where Winchester is. And I'm doing this presentation on automating information security. This is my first time at RVAsec. This is my first security conference. This is my first time presenting. There's a lot of firsts going on here. So it's very emotional for me. I just want you to know. A little bit about my background. I've been a systems administrator for about 6 years. I spent the first 5.5 years working in a jail as a systems administrator. So that was a lot of fun. I recently graduated from American Public University, and this presentation is sort of a summation of my thesis. And a little bit about putting the theory of what I was writing about when I wrote the thesis into practice with the new job that I have. When I came to work at Frederick Water, they hired me in part because I have a security background, and we have an ICS system that we are heavily invested in for obvious reasons and that we want to make sure is secure. So they liked a lot of what I was saying about automation and my plans for the future of how organizations can automate, and they wanted to put some of that into practice. So I'm on Twitter at foolish_prof, although I don't really know how to use Twitter very well, so if you follow me, it won't be that thrilling. And you can email me later if you have questions at danny.mccaslin@frederickwater.com. So when I was approaching my thesis, I started looking at the current attack space. The attacks are becoming more complex than they ever were in the past. I remember when I was a teenager, you had to worry about viruses. You had these old school ideas of what a computer virus was, and a lot of times you would get these things by having some like floppy disk that you would put into your computer and either having corrupted code on it or something that maybe someone's giving away a free game, but the free game comes with unexpected consequences. And as things progressed, as we moved into using the internet more with the rise of Web 2.0, we've seen things like cross-site scripting attacks, and we've seen, and now the biggest thing that you can even see it in our vendor space out there, one of the things that they're talking about a lot is ransomware, because ransomware is a big deal. It used to be if a computer gets a virus, that one computer might be out for a while, but now if you've got something that can not only encrypt that entire computer, but can also encrypt like every drive, every network resource that computer is connected to, you're talking about a bad time. So it's not, we can't be working in a space where we're just like good enough. And we as security administrators and systems administrators in general, we're all stretched thin. We all have thousands of things to do. I've never worked in a shop with more than 3 people in it as far as IT goes. So it's hard to maintain all of these things that you have to maintain with such a small staff. And of course, the budgets are tight, and every time you request new people, I've always worked for governments, by the way, but every time you request new people, it gets denied, and so you just have to make do with what you can make do with, and the attackers are getting more organized. In the current position I'm in, I have to worry about something that I've never really had to worry about before, which is the advanced persistent threat. Of course, they're going to target things that are, if you can target a water company where you can control access to the systems over the internet, if you can turn off water, or you can do something to sewage treatment that would end up flooding a local stream with sewage, I mean, that's critical infrastructure that we have to worry about. So even though we're a small shop, we have these worries that we have to that come up that we can't just take care of with like the simple basic tool sets. So I started looking into automation. I found that according to the Ponemon study, the security teams that automate, they see a lower cost for security breaches. And automation has always kind of been part of information security. Whenever we get into the nuts and bolts of this, one of the things that is going to come up is that a lot of these security controls that get recommended by the National Institute of Standards and Technology are things that are built into the operating system itself. Things like user control and group control and access control lists and things like that we have been dealing with since day one as IT people. So the industry as a whole is moving towards automation. If you work in a shop where you do DevOps, I'm sure that there's plenty of functions there that are being automated with tools like Ansible and Chef and Puppet. That these things are becoming automated daily so that you can send out patches as quickly as possible. And automation limits mistakes. This is one of the reasons that I approach this. And I consider myself to be pretty good at my job, but I once did a self-assessment with user creation, just the simple task of creating a user and making sure that user can access everything they need to access in the network and do everything that they need to be able to do and not get into things that they're not supposed to get into. And I was at about 70%. And I consider myself to be pretty good at my job, but that's doing it all by hand, doing it all, trying to remember the entire process. There would always be something, typically it was that they couldn't get access when they needed it, but still that doesn't reflect well on an IT department, doesn't reflect well on a security staff when someone new comes to work for your company and they have to wait a day or two before they can, say, access their email or log into a specific server because you have forgotten to put that information in. So automation also frees us up to perform higher level tasks. If we can automate all of this nuts and bolts work, it frees us up to be able to go to more meetings, and that's what going to work is all about, right, is having endless meetings. So at least that's where your boss wants you. So let me define what I mean by automation, and these are the definitions that I used in the paper. When I say that something is fully automated, I mean that it's going to take information from a device, and it's going to process that information based on a predefined set of rules and do something else with it. So this would be of course there's going to be a setup process for any kind of automated task, but this would be no user input. This would just be one system does something. Think about like if you had a task in Windows that every time an event happened, it would send you an email. That's an automated task. The event occurs, it sends an email, that's fully automated. A partially automated task is something where a human has to input some information in order to make the task work. User creation would be a good example of this. We can't just automatically create users because then you'd have a whole bunch of random usernames and you wouldn't necessarily match them up with the real users. So you have to have some user input in that process. That would be like username, department, full name, those kind of things. Machine readable data, I started to see that there were aspects of automation that it wasn't necessarily that the step could be automated, but the step could generate data that could then be used by some other system. So training was a good example of this. Everyone recommends that you train your employees and your staff, your coworkers, like do security training, things like phishing training and describing like the attack space and how they can best protect themselves. You can't really automate that process, but you can have a test and you can use the data that comes out of that test to decide, say, how often that you want to have them retake their security training. Or, so I was looking at things like that when I was looking at machine readable data. And then there are some tasks that are just not automatable, like meetings. So I had to have some kind of way of gauging what do we mean when we say security controls? And of course there's confirmation bias, so I could have just rattled off the list of things that were at the top of my head at the time, things that we can automate, and said, yeah, we can automate all of these things, so we can automate lots of stuff. But I needed some kind of a list of things to go off of. And so I used the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the special publication 800-12. They have a list of 276 security controls that are distributed amongst 20 families. All of the controls are tied to a security framework that's laid out in SP 800-37 for how best to secure your network and respond to incidents. So these are those control families, and there's a lot of them. We have access control, audit and accountability, awareness and training, assessment, authorization, and monitoring, configuration management, contingency planning, identification and authentication, individual participation, incident response, maintenance, media protection, privacy authorization, personnel security, physical and environmental security, planning, program management, risk assessment, systems and services acquisition, systems and communication protection, and systems and information integrity. And there will be a test on those at the end of the presentation, so take a picture if you have to. So, and a few of these, as I was doing research, the things like individual participation and privacy authorization were things that were added between the older version and the newer one, and they really kind of account for things like your privacy policies on web pages and things like that. So, how does it all look? This is what I came up with. The bar represents the fact that that those particular categories can be somewhat automatable to at least a certain extent. You'll see you have high marks with the in identification and authentication. You have high marks with system and communication protection and system and information integrity. And then the other, I think the other highest point is, sorry, I don't even remember what the CM is configuration management. So that's the other high point that you have. And you'll notice low points in places where you would probably expect assessment, authorization, and monitoring. That's a place where you won't have a lot of things that can be automated. Program management doesn't have a lot that can be automated. And some of this boils down to the way they define the security controls. And the list of security controls, again, there's 276 of them. So to provide a full list, you'd really need to check out their documents. So none of this really was all that surprising when it all came out. We already automate a lot. Access control, most of our access controls, at least as far as our local networks go, are going to be operating system-based controls or server-based controls. If you're in a Microsoft shop, you're using Active Directory. And we're a Microsoft shop. I can probably speak more to that than I can any other. So, we're using Active Directory and systems like that to do all of our access control. So all of that sort of happens within that framework. AAA, you're using operating system and radius controls. For the CIA framework, you're using the operating system. For configuration, you're using things like group policy and Chef, Puppet. We already have these tools that we've been using for quite a while. As I said, user creation, if you really think about it, is a security task, and it's something that is automatable, at least as far as access goes. So if we look at the audit and accountability families and the identification and authentication, they're the most rife for full automation, or full and partial automation. So it makes sense because they are required by, or they are handled by the operating system, and they don't require a lot of extra work. So you can create, whenever you create users, you know what department they're in, you know what groups you can put them in, and at least in Windows systems, when you can nest groups, you can put someone in maybe one or two groups that gives them access to everything they need to have access to. And that's something that can easily be scripted out using a tool like PowerShell or even Bash scripting. If you combine these with things like AAA and the authentication, authorization, and accounting triad, you can see how that kind of becomes easier. My favorite, I love the fact that when I walk into work, I don't have to remember a separate password for my Wi-Fi account. I can just log in with the same password that I use for logging into my computer. It makes it easier for the users, and combining that, it's really just a matter of having your Radius server talk to Active Directory. Configuration management by its nature is an automated task. I mean, you're talking about changing settings in a computer based on predefined set of rules and instructions that you've given it. So when you think about things like group policy, that's an automation task. It's a partial automation, actually no, if you really think about it in a sense, it's really fully automated. I think I counted it more as partial automation because I was thinking about you have to set up the rules. But once you set up those rules once, in a perfect world, you never have to change them again. But so I really think I probably should have counted that more as a fully automated task, but c'est la vie, right? So I wanted to look at a couple of the things that were a little bit more surprising. Systems and communication protection. When we look at the requirements for what NIST is talking about when they say systems and communication protection, they're talking about protecting data at rest and in transit. They're talking about segregating functionality to specific servers or subnets. They're talking about the separation of user functionality and systems management, establishing boundaries for public accessibility and monitoring and monitor and controlling communications at the exterior boundary. So we all do all of this, right? We all have separate user accounts for our admin tasks and our user accounts, and we all use separate computers, right, for our admin tasks and our user accounts, so that if something was to happen to our computer, no, I don't think everyone does that. Microsoft recently recommended that we all have a separate admin computer along with our regular computer, so we perform administrative tasks on one and our user tasks on another. And yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So if we look at automation, we have intrusion detection and prevention that's going to be monitoring that gateway. We have firewalls and firewall rules that are going to be monitoring the gateway. We have policy-based access control that can allow for access to data. And all of these can be applied at the network level and at the host level. You can have host systems that do all of these tasks just as well as you can have network level systems that are performing these things. System and information integrity, we're talking about guarding against improper modification or destruction, so making sure that when someone saves a file, that file remains as it is in its safe state. Ensuring non-repudiation and authenticity, so again, making sure that data that's saved remains the way it's supposed to be. Flaw remediation, malicious code protection, non-persistence, and memory protection. And so when we look at automating these, we're looking at scheduled file integrity checks. We're looking at automating access control and access logging. We're looking at virtualization, systems monitoring and memory protection, spam protection, input validation, flaw remediation. I think the statistics are showing that most of the bad things that come into our network are coming in through email. So, things like spam protection are, of course, very important in that space. So one thing leads to another, or at least I think it should. So I asked the question, why is it that when we discover a piece of malware on our network that the anti-malware or antivirus doesn't send some message to the firewall to block whatever IP that came from? Why aren't the clients communicating? Why is it that when clients communicate with known malicious IPs, those clients aren't being blocked out of the network? Why is configuration management sometimes seen as an afterthought? Has anyone ever run into a problem in something like group policy and just like got tired of banging your head against the wall, so you just stopped and said, I'll do it myself? Why do we, that's kind of looking at it as an afterthought, and I do it myself, but why do we do that? If we're really serious about making sure that we're secure and that our configuration matches the template that we want, we should be a little bit more, or maybe I should be, maybe you guys are better than I am at all of this. So I think we have all of this automation in place, but we let everything sit in silos. So we have antivirus over here, and we have our firewall there, and we have intrusion protection and detection, or intrusion prevention and detection, and we have all of these little silos, and we don't let them communicate with each other, or at least they're not necessarily built natively to communicate with each other. And now there are systems in place that can help do that, and I'll discuss some of that in a moment. But I think that the future of this endeavor, this trying to automate information security, is going to involve trying to get all these disparate systems to communicate with each other. It doesn't really make sense if you know something is happening on your network that shouldn't be happening. It doesn't really make sense to require some kind of manual intervention to make it stop. It should be something that the system itself is able to handle on its own. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about you have some kind of a system health and security monitoring system. And I tried to animate this with arrows and all kinds of fancy stuff. And that was the point that I figured out that I don't really know how to use PowerPoint. So you have systems health and security, and it's informing all of these other things. It's informing provisioning. It's informing accounting and access. It's informing configuration management. It's informing protection. So if something goes wrong in accounting and access, let's say that there's some kind of a log in systems health and security that says that a user that is sitting down the hall is logging in from a Russian IP. There should be some kind of a protection thing that would kick in and stop that user's ability to log in. Even if it's, we worry a lot about false positives, but even if it's a false positive, even if there is some rational explanation for why it's happening, I asked my boss this. I said, let's imagine that I saw a log, that a log came through that said that you were logging in from China. And that's what the log is showing, that you're logging in from China. My boss has never been to China. I said, would you rather have a system that would just automatically shut down your account or disable your account so that nothing could occur, and then we can piece it all together later, or would you rather I come in at 6 o'clock the next morning and see that that log is there and then try to do something manually to solve the problem 3 or 4 hours after the initial breach may have occurred? And he says, of course, I would rather the system itself shut down my user account. And it makes sense, right? If we're dealing with attackers that are organized and we're dealing with attackers that can get to us at any time of the day or night, we should have systems in place that can respond to those attacks at any time during the day or night. I know that's kind of scary because it means that we don't always have eyes on everything whenever we make a decision like disabling an account or blocking an IP address. But at the same time, I'd rather have a few false positives than to have all of our data stolen because we decided that we didn't want to have to deal with the problems that the false positives cause. So each of these things can also inform other, like provisioning, for instance. If you run some web servers that are under heavy load, provisioning will occur, but the provisioning should also trigger configuration management so that those servers, those new servers that are being spun up to handle that extra traffic can actually function properly instead of just being empty boxes. So all of these things should inform each other, and they should all also inform the system health and security. If you imagine this being animated, it's a lot more spectacular. At least it was in my head. So what do we have right now? We do have Siemens source solutions. By the way, have you noticed that Siem is pronounced differently depending on what vent? Like, there's a company called Simplify that calls it Sim. There's a company called Sea Monster that calls it Siem. I think you can just pick however you want to pronounce it. So Siem solutions offer the ability to collect and manage all of the organization's security information in one location. The thing that I like about Siem solutions is that I can have all of my logs flowing into one location, and I can have each log sort of informing the others so that when I'm looking at, say, a firewall log, it's not just giving me an IP address and the local network that the thing is communicating with, it's also giving me its DNS name because it's also pulling information out of DNS. So it's very handy. I'm also new at my organization, so I don't know the IP scheme as well as like my cohorts do. So I have to, being able to rely on something like that to help is very nice. They provide visibility and linkage between multiple events across multiple platforms, and they can correlate behaviors quickly for analysis. So that is really great. The first time I ever tested a Siem solution, I found out that there were a handful of users that didn't have password reset policies. And I know what he said earlier about password reset policies, but it's not even our decision to have the password reset policies. It's actually some auditor somewhere that tells us that in order to pass our audit, we have to have a password reset policy. So in order to make sure that we would pass that audit, I was able to fix that problem. But it was something that was done years ago, and for some reason was never changed, and it was just left as an afterthought. So those are the kinds of things that having these kind of security monitoring and controls can help with. SOAR solutions can provide a way for administrators to automate and orchestrate the behavior across systems and tools. So this is what this is sort of the goal, right, is to have one system be able to communicate with another and tell it you need to do this because something is happening. So having your antivirus vendor blocking ranges of IP addresses that it's seeing malware from, or having a configuration management be controlled by some other outside system. You can automate an action based on behavior, and you can orchestrate large-scale automation chains that require access to multiple systems. So it becomes really handy when you're trying to protect your system and your network. So putting this all into practice, like I said, when I was hired with Frederick Water, they said we want to do some of this. And then I started looking at vendors, and I started throwing some price tags, and they said, well, wait a minute, because a lot of these tools are fairly expensive. There's some free options available for managing an organization's security. One of the things that we're using right now is Security Onion. We had no network monitoring before we installed Security Onion, and it's actually been fairly helpful. I found it to be a fairly easy to start using tool, and it's one of these things where you can start it up and start pulling in your logs and learning how to classify things, and then as you grow with it, you're able to learn more about the way the tool works and make configuration changes to make it work for your network. So automation can be done through scripting or through the use of more complex tools. We use a lot of PowerShell scripting. We use some Python scripting. Different systems will have different levels of access that you're allowed to have into that system. For instance, you might have a vendor that's going to lock out certain behaviors, and you won't be able to automate all tasks, but you can automate some. I'm sorry, I just read that. You can start small and work your way up to larger projects. The first automation thing that I ever did was to send emails to users whose passwords were close to expiration because we didn't have any system in place to do that already. So I thought, well, this should be a fairly simple, get a date, check it against is it within a week? If it's within a week, we'll send you an email. You can familiarize yourself with the non-security centric automation platforms, and you have to prepare to spend a lot of time up front. You can spend, I think I spent my entire morning writing a script yesterday that will save me a ton of time in the future, but it took all morning to get it right. So this is one of my favorite cartoons. I'm running through this thing really fast. One of my favorite cartoons, I spent a lot of time on this task, and I should write a program to automate it. This is from XKCD. I'm sure a lot of you read XKCD. Because really what happens is we get into this phase where we think, we can automate it. We start writing the code, the automation takes over, we have all this free time. But what really happens is we start writing the code, and then we run into a problem, or we start rethinking the way it should work, and we do debugging and then ongoing development, and we don't have time for the original task anymore. You want to try to avoid this, of course. You have to, I think some of the things that he said this morning kind of match. We have to be sort of business-centric as we do this. That's why I think the Siemens source solutions can be very helpful. The biggest takeaway that I got from all of this is that a lot of these solutions, companies will offer a way that you can pay to add certain functionality to the systems, or pay for a whole other system that can handle things for you. But you can do a lot of this stuff yourself based on task schedulers and cron jobs and things like that to perform. I have alerts that'll happen if certain events occur on certain servers where it'll send emails to me informing me. You kind of wonder why a lot of that wasn't built in anyway. But so as far as open source security controls go, I know this is really, it's probably hard to read, but this is a list that I go back to. You can find this. They said that all of these are going to be on the website. So you can go back to this. This is a list that I go back to anytime someone comes to me and says, we need to do X, Y, or Z. Because usually they mean that they come to me outside of a budget cycle, and I don't have the money to just go out and buy a solution. So I can at least use one of these for a while until I can get something better in place. Or maybe not better. Maybe better is the wrong word, something easier to use, because sometimes these can be a little bit more difficult. But these are, if you're looking for security controls, of course, these are options that are available to you, and a lot of them will have ways that you can slide your code in and work between one program and another to make it do what you need it to do. So in the past 3 months, I've spoken to at least 3 vendors that have told me that their API is coming soon. I had a SIEM vendor who we were talking with, and they had a very select group of inputs. Like they could take an input from DNS, and they could take an input from DHCP, and they could take an input from like 5 vendors. But when I asked about what about other input? What about other vendors? Like if I'm using a different AV vendor or I'm using a different firewall vendor than what you've got here, can we take in data from there? And they said, well, not yet, because we don't have our API up yet. And I thought, well, what's the use of a SIEM that doesn't have an open API that you can punch your data into? I don't want to say bad things about like particular vendors, so I'm not going to name names, but so I'm in a small company. We have less than 100 people working for us. So another thing that I've actually gotten a bit lately is we usually market that to larger SOCs, or we're sorry, but the current product we don't sell it to anyone with less than 1,000 endpoints. So, and I work in government. I've worked in government my whole career, and the entire county that we live in doesn't have 1,000 endpoints. Like all of county government is under 1,000 endpoints. Like that's a lot. And I'm sure a lot of you probably work for larger companies, but from my perspective, being a small organization, and I can kind of understand, like, yeah, it can suck to have to work with a small company because you're not going to get as big of a paycheck or whatever. But at the same time, like, if you're telling me you have the best security, or whatever, you have the best application for this or that, so I'm only supposed to take second best because I'm small. The other factor is that being part of critical infrastructure, I can't just say, oh, well, we're a small company. I have to do something to protect the back end of all of these systems. So the fact that we're small it sometimes works to a disadvantage for us because some of the vendors don't necessarily like to take us seriously in the automation space. Or that feature costs extra. This is something I think that you could talk about a sort of ghettoization of information security, because you have some, particularly with some modern systems where you have like the cloud sharing, the cloud-based systems. You're now paying extra for things that would have just been part of your network before. I said I wouldn't name names, but I'm going to name names. Office 365 comes to mind because you can't protect Office 365 in the same way that you protected your on-prem solution because obviously it's in the cloud. You can't use firewall rules. You have to come up with some other way of protecting it. And Microsoft will, of course, upsell you a protection package for that. But it's something that I actually kind of worry about, because are we now going to start creating some environment where only the people who can really afford to add all these extra features to their security platform are able to add it. Operating systems came with the ability to use passwords because they were a necessity for security. But now that we're saying that passwords are kind of overrated and we need to move on to something else, they want to sell us on, here's the something else that you have to buy that's extra. We're still going to run this password system that we're telling you is inherently insecure, but we're going to try to upsell you on something that will actually help secure you. So that's a different soapbox for a different time. And if I haven't alienated every vendor in the place, maybe I can come back next year and I'll talk about it. But so moving forward, the things that I'm trying to keep in mind in our organization, anytime we talk with a vendor, I want to make sure that they take the idea of security automation seriously. You remember back when we used to have to tell people writing code, like, think about security as you write your code. We as security professionals have to think about automation as we start buying security packages instead of thinking about it as an afterthought. It sometimes is heartbreaking because you get really into a product and then you say, hey, what about automation? And oh, we can't do that yet, or that's coming later down the road. But it's going to save you a lot of headache if you're working with vendors that are already taking that seriously. Even if it's something where you have to go into the API and do the work yourself, at least if it has an open API for you to do that, you have that ability. We need to treat automation as part of the security framework and not as an afterthought. That's I think really the key takeaway. If we can do that, I think we will actually become like better as an industry. I have this theory that's completely not evidence-based, but that IT security works somewhat like the idea of herd immunity. Like, the more we can secure all the disparate systems, the less likely it is that the vendors are gonna, or that the bad guys are gonna be able to get a foothold anywhere, because of this sense that if most people are protected against something, well, they're gonna stop trying to exploit it. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I think that there's something to that. Support open source developers in the security and automation space, because as we support open source developers, they put out new things onto the market, and those things end up ultimately working their way into the paid vendor space, and it of course drives down costs. I think the perfect example of that is web browsers. The first web browser that did tabs was an open source web browser, right? So, and now you can't imagine a web browser without tabs. So, and then utilize available automation solutions. If you have the ability to automate it, automate it. You shouldn't be spending, your time is too valuable, you shouldn't be spending your time trying to move from one system to another and trying to tell it to do something that a machine could tell it to do. So use your time more wisely. Take the time to set up those automated solutions that are already built into your network, and let them roll. And sure, you're going to deal with false positives, but I think in the end, you're going to come up with a more secure environment, and you'll be better off for it. So, are there any questions? Anyone want to throw things at me? You mean like what task has been or? You always have the every day reports that you get it, mm-hmm. But then you got to figure out how to automate it. And sometimes you're working with Linux, sometimes you're working with Office 365. There's always this, how do I automate it? Use Mac, PowerShell, whatever. So if you found something that has been really useful in connecting modern things to make the automation. I have found, we've tested 2 SOAR solutions so far, and I've found that to be like really, really nice, because most of the time the work's already been done for you beforehand. Like all of the scripts that you would need to run have already sort of been built, and so you just plug in your company's information, and it's able to move data and move behaviors back and forth as you see fit. So the SOAR systems that we have tried they're automated based on like playbooks, kind of like Ansible, and so you're able to just kind of, if you're using Fortinet, you put your Fortinet data in, or like information for how to log in and those kind of things, and then it's able to take that information and through the playbooks to do things. So that's the easiest way to do it. It's also the most costly. Being a Windows shop, I use a lot of PowerShell. So I have a lot of things where if an event occurs, a PowerShell script will run, and then it'll send me an email telling me it did something. And that's another thing that I would highly recommend. As you start this space, throw in that, like, send me an email to let me know that it did something. After a while, you're going to want to get rid of those, because you're going to be inundated with emails that your automated systems are sending you, and that's the last thing you need as well. But in the beginning, it can be very helpful, first of all, to know that your automation is running properly. And second of all, if you're making mistakes, it's the quickest way to catch them. So if you end up blocking an IP range, say, in your firewall that you didn't really want to block, but because of the way you wrote the code, it misinterpreted what you really meant, it's the quickest way to catch those kind of mistakes. So, anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your